The steel hull of landing craft Tank 723 groaned against the violent swells as Private First Class Robert Sullivan pressed his helmet against the cold metal wall. Dawn had not yet broken on June 6, 1944, but the young soldier from Nebraska could already hear the distant thunder of naval bombardment pounding the French coast. Around him, 30 other men of the 1st Infantry Division sat in grim silence, their faces pale green in the dim light filtering through the craft's narrow opening. Sullivan clutched his M1 Garand rifle with trembling hands, its familiar weight offering little comfort against the churning fear in his stomach. Intelligence reports had promised light resistance, but the ominous sound of German artillery already contradicted those optimistic assessments. Captain James Mitchell of Company A moved carefully between his men, checking equipment and offering quiet words of encouragement. The 26-year-old officer from Massachusetts had led these soldiers through the bloody campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, but nothing had prepared him for the magnitude of Operation Overlord. He knew that success or failure of the entire Western Front might depend on what happened in the next few hours. The landing craft's engine suddenly throttled down, and coxswain Tommy Henderson called out over the noise, 10 minutes to beach. His voice carried the strain of a sailor who had already made 3 runs to the hostile shore, witnessing the carnage that awaited each new wave of assault troops. The previous landing crafts had reported devastating machine gun fire from the German strongpoints overlooking the beach. Through the metal sides of their vessel, the Americans could hear the distinctive whistle and crash of German artillery shells landing in the water around them. The enemy had transformed Omaha Beach into a killing field, with interlocking fields of fire from concrete bunkers and hidden positions carved into the bluffs. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's defensive preparations had turned the peaceful Norman coastline into a fortress of death. Sergeant William Hayes of the 29th Infantry Division checked his watch. 0630 hours. In the gray pre-dawn light, he could see the silhouettes of hundreds of other landing crafts approaching the beach in successive waves. The largest seaborne invasion in military history was unfolding before their eyes, with 156,000 Allied troops committed to breaking through Hitler's Fortress Europe, as referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work D-Day, June 6, 1944, the climactic battle of World War II. The men facing Omaha Beach understood they were participating in history's most crucial military operation. Private Sullivan said a silent prayer as the craft lurched forward through the surf. Behind them, the battleships USS Texas and USS Arkansas continued their thunderous bombardment, their massive shells screaming overhead toward the German positions. But already, green flares were rising from the beach, German signals calling for concentrated artillery fire on the approaching Americans. The young private thought of his sweetheart Mary back in Lincoln, Nebraska, and a letter he had written the night before but never sent. Around him, other soldiers made their peace with whatever gods they served, knowing that many would not see another sunset. The steel door of landing craft Tank 723 prepared to drop, and with it would begin the bloodiest chapter of the longest day in the war against Nazi tyranny. The ramp of landing craft Tank 723 crashed down into the churning surf at 0645 hours, and immediately the harsh rattle of German machine guns filled the morning air. Captain Mitchell shouted, "Move, move, move," as his men plunged into chest-deep water, struggling against the weight of their soaked equipment and the deadly crossfire from the bluffs above. Private Sullivan stumbled forward, fighting to keep his rifle above the waves as bullets snapped past his head like angry hornets. To his left, Corporal Danny Rodriguez from San Antonio went down with a strangled cry, the cold channel water turning crimson around his motionless form. The carefully planned assault was already dissolving into chaos as German gunners in White Stan's Nest 70 poured devastating fire into the exposed Americans. The beach stretched before them like a nightmare landscape of obstacles and death. Steel hedgehogs and Belgian gates jutted from the sand at odd angles, designed to tear apart landing craft and trap advancing infantry. Behind these obstacles, the Germans had sown thousands of mines and strung concertina wire to channel the attackers into predetermined killing zones. Staff Sergeant Hayes tried to rally his squad near a disabled Sherman tank, one of 32 amphibious duplex drive tanks that had been launched afar from shore. Most had sunk in the rough seas, taking their crews to watery graves and leaving the infantry without crucial armored support. The few tanks that reached the beach sat burning or broken, their steel hulls serving only as temporary shelter for desperate soldiers. From his concrete bunker overlooking the carnage, Obergefreiter Hans Mueller of the 352nd Infantry Division methodically fed ammunition belts into his MG-40 to machine gun. The 20-year-old from Bavaria had been defending this section of coastline for 8 months, and his position commanded a perfect field of fire across the entire beach. Below him, American soldiers fell by the dozens as they struggled through the surf and across the sand. The German artillery observers in the church steeple of Vierville-sur-Mer called down increasingly accurate fire on the landing zones. Shells from the powerful 105th mm howitzers of Artillery Regiment 1716 crashed among the Americans, sending geysers of sand and shrapnel skyward. Each explosion marked another group of young men whose dreams of home would never be realized. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Canham of the 116th Infantry Regiment took shrapnel in his right hand but continued directing his scattered companies toward their objectives. The West Point graduate from Virginia had studied the German defenses for months, but the reality exceeded his worst expectations. His regiment was being systematically destroyed by an enemy that held every tactical advantage. Private First Class Anthony Palermo of Brooklyn found himself alone behind a steel tetrahedron, surrounded by the bodies of his squad mates. The 19-year-old had enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor, driven by patriotic fury that now seemed naive in the face of mechanized death. German snipers in the seaside villas picked off individual targets with methodical precision, their scope rifles claiming lives with each measured shot. By 0730 hours, the assault on Omaha Beach was approaching complete failure, their officers dead or wounded, their communications equipment destroyed by saltwater and enemy fire. Landing craft coxswains reported that the beach was too hot for further landings, and several vessels turned back rather than add to the slaughter. But in small groups scattered across 6 miles of hostile shore, American soldiers began to demonstrate the stubborn courage that would ultimately prevail against Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Brigadier General Norman Cota of the 29th Infantry Division waded ashore at 0745 hours, his aide shot dead beside him before their boots touched French sand. The 51-year-old general from Massachusetts had earned his stars through competent leadership in previous campaigns. But Omaha Beach presented challenges beyond any military textbook. Walking upright through machine gun fire, he began gathering survivors and organizing desperate counterattacks. "What outfit is this?" Cota demanded of a group of soldiers huddled behind the wooden seawall. When told they belonged to the 5th Ranger Battalion, the general delivered words that would become legendary. "Well then, goddamn it, if you're Rangers, get up there and lead the way." His example of fearless leadership began to inspire scattered groups of Americans to move inland against the German positions. Technical Sergeant Philip Strechik and Private First Class Joseph Pinder of the 16th Infantry Regiment had volunteered for one of the war's most dangerous assignments. Forward artillery observers, using his radio to guide the massive shells from offshore battleships onto targets that were decimating American troops. The concrete bunkers of White Stansness 74 seemed impregnable. As Staff Sergeant William Courtney's squad approached from the west, the German position commanded the Vierville Draw, the most important exit from Omaha Beach. Machine guns and mortars from the bunker had already killed dozens of Americans attempting to advance inland. Courtney knew that taking this position was essential to the entire operation's success. Private First Class Carlton Barrett crawled forward with a satchel charge, the 20-pound explosive device representing the squad's only hope of breaching the reinforced concrete. German defenders spotted his movement and concentrated their fire on the young soldier from Kentucky. Barrett pressed forward despite multiple wounds, reaching the rear of the bunker before detonating the charge and sacrificing his life to silence the guns. At Point Du Hoc, 3 miles west of the main landing zones, Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder led to 125 Rangers in a vertical assault on German artillery positions. Using ropes and ladders, the elite troops scaled the 100-foot cliffs under devastating fire from defenders above. When they reached the gun positions, the Rangers discovered that the massive 155 mm cannons had been replaced with wooden decoys. But their heroic assault had drawn German reserves away from Omaha Beach. Colonel George Taylor of the 16th Infantry Regiment moved among his decimated companies, rallying survivors with words that capture the desperate situation. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." His blunt assessment motivated scattered soldiers to begin moving inland, despite the withering fire from German positions. Corporal John McPherson of the 3rd Ranger Battalion found himself alone in a crater created by naval bombardment, surrounded by the bodies of his teammates. The young Scotsman from Glasgow had immigrated to America in 1939 and enlisted immediately after Pearl Harbor. Now, armed only with his Thompson submachine gun and grenades, he began a solitary assault on a German machine gun nest that had been decimating American reinforcements. Navy Lieutenant Junior Grade Lloyd Peterson commanded Landing Craft Tank 611, making repeated trips to the hostile shore despite damage to his vessel from German artillery. When his craft became too damaged to continue, Peterson stripped off his naval uniform and joined the infantry assault, using his knowledge of the beach obstacles to guide advancing soldiers through safe passages. The German defenders, despite their advantageous positions, began to show signs of strain as individual acts of American heroism multiplied across the battlefield. Ammunition supplies dwindled, communications with higher headquarters became sporadic, and the psychological pressure of facing seemingly endless waves of determined attackers began to affect morale in the concrete bunkers overlooking the beach. By 0900 hours, small groups of American soldiers had begun to breach the German defensive line. At several points along Omaha Beach, Captain Mitchell, though wounded in the shoulder, led a mixed group of survivors from 3 different companies through a gap in the wire near the Les Moulins Draw. The breakthrough came at enormous cost, with only 37 men remaining from the original company of 190 soldiers who had landed 4 hours earlier. Lieutenant Walter Taylor of the 2nd Ranger Battalion had discovered a narrow path up the bluffs that German defenders had left lightly guarded. The 23-year-old officer from Oregon led 15 men in a dangerous flanking maneuver, crawling through minefields and under machine gun fire to reach positions behind the main German defensive line. From there, his small force began attacking the concrete bunkers from their vulnerable rear entrances. Destroyer USS McCook, under command of Captain William Kellogg, violated standing orders by moving dangerously close to shore to provide direct fire support for the struggling infantry. The warship's 5-inch guns began systematically destroying German strongpoints at point-blank range, despite the risk of running aground in the shallow water. Other destroyers followed this example, creating a wall of naval gunfire that finally began to suppress the devastating defensive fire. The 19-year-old pre-medical student from New York refused evacuation, instead helping wounded comrades reach cover while directing other soldiers toward weak points in the German defenses. His detailed knowledge of human anatomy, gained through his medical studies, helped him treat wounded soldiers under fire. Hauptmann Wilhelm Haller, commanding the German garrison at Weiderstansness 72, began to realize that his defensive positions were being systematically eliminated. Radio contact with regimental headquarters had been lost since 0830 hours, and American naval gunfire was making his concrete bunkers untenable. Several of his machine gun crews had been killed by satchel charges, and ammunition was running critically low. The German reserves, consisting of 2 companies from the 916th Infantry Regiment, had been held far inland by conflicting orders from higher command. Field Marshal Rommel's defensive doctrine called for immediate counterattacks, but confusion about Allied deception operations at Pas-de-Calais prevented German commanders from committing their mobile reserves to the Normandy battle. Sergeant Leonard Lommel and Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn of the 2nd Ranger Battalion had made a remarkable discovery while searching for the missing German artillery at Point du Hoc. Hidden in an orchard 1,000 yards inland, they found the actual 155mm guns that had been moved from the coastal positions. Using thermite grenades, the 2 Rangers single-handedly destroyed the artillery that could have devastated Alliance shipping. In the invasion area, Medical Corpsman Cecil Nash of the 1st Infantry Division worked tirelessly under fire, treating wounded soldiers on the beach despite having no protection from German snipers. The conscientious objector from Tennessee had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in the Medical Corps, and his courage under fire saved dozens of lives during the critical morning hours. German soldiers, recognizing his Red Cross armband, occasionally held their fire while he evacuated wounded Americans. By 1000 hours, approximately 1,500 American casualties lay scattered across Omaha Beach. But the German defensive system was finally beginning to crack. Small penetrations in multiple locations were expanding as more soldiers moved inland, and naval gunfire was systematically destroying the concrete emplacements that had dominated the battlefield since dawn. Colonel Charles Canham, despite his wounds, established a command post 200 yards inland and began coordinating the scattered attacks into a cohesive assault. His ability to maintain tactical control under impossible conditions marked the turning point in the battle for Omaha Beach, transforming individual acts of heroism into organized military success. The afternoon of June 6 brought a fundamental shift in the battle for Omaha Beach, as coordinated American attacks finally began to collapse the German defensive system. Major Sidney Bingham of the 2nd Battalion, 116th Infantry, had assembled a force of 120 men from various units and launched a systematic assault on the remaining German strongpoints overlooking the Vierville Draw. Technical Sergeant Frank Pergori of Company K, 116th Infantry, single-handedly attacked a complex of German positions that had been holding up the advance for hours. The 25-year-old from Virginia crawled through heavy machine gun fire, used hand grenades to clear 3 separate bunkers, and personally killed 8 German soldiers while capturing 30 prisoners. His extraordinary courage opened a crucial gap in the German defensive line. Oberleutnant Arthur Jank, commanding the German garrison at Weiterstandsness 72, made the difficult decision to abandon his position as American naval gunfire made it untenable. The veteran officer had fought on the Eastern Front before being assigned to coastal defense duty, and he recognized that his scattered forces could not continue to hold their exposed positions against overwhelming Allied firepower and determination. Captain John R. Molino of the 5th Ranger Battalion led a desperate assault on the German positions, controlling the Point de la Percy. The brutal close-quarters fighting lasted for 2 hours, but eventually the Rangers succeeded in eliminating the last German resistance. Overlooking the eastern section of Omaha Beach, Private First Class Jimmy Monteth of Company L, 16th Infantry, though severely wounded, continued to lead his squad against a series of German pillboxes near Colville-sur-Mer. The 25-year-old from Virginia used his knowledge of German defensive tactics, gained through intelligence briefings, to outflank positions that had been considered impregnable. His tactical skill and personal courage inspired other soldiers to follow his example. The German artillery observers in the church towers of Vierville-sur-Mer and St. Lawrence-sur-Mer found themselves under attack by American soldiers who had infiltrated through the defensive perimeter. Sergeant Charles Shea of the 16th Infantry Regiment led a small team in a dangerous mission to eliminate these observation posts, knowing that German artillery fire would continue to devastate the beach until the observers were silenced. By 1400 hours, elements of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions had advanced nearly 2 miles inland, establishing positions that threatened the German supply lines to the coastal fortifications. Lieutenant Colonel John Williamson of the 18th Infantry Regiment set up his command post in a Norman farmhouse, from which he could coordinate the final assault on the remaining German strongpoints. General Major Dietrich Kreis, commanding the German 352nd Infantry Division, received increasingly desperate reports from his subordinate commanders. The Atlantic Wall, which Nazi propaganda had proclaimed invincible, was crumbling under the sustained assault of American infantry, supported by overwhelming naval gunfire. Private Robert Sales of Company F, 116th Infantry, discovered a German ammunition dump hidden in a concrete bunker near the village of Vierville. Rather than reporting the find and waiting for demolition experts, Sales used German explosive charges to destroy the facility, eliminating a critical supply source for the defending troops. The explosion could be heard across the battlefield, serving as a symbol of American momentum. As evening approached on June 6, 1944, the character of the battle had fundamentally changed. Instead of German defenders shooting down and exposed American attackers, small groups of American soldiers were now hunting the remaining German positions from advantageous inland positions. The bloodiest day in American military history since Antietam was drawing to a close, but victory on Omaha Beach was finally within reach. As darkness fell on June 6, 1944, the Americans had secured a foothold on Omaha Beach that extended 6 miles wide and up to 2 miles deep. The cost had been staggering, over 2,400 casualties, including more than 400 dead, making it the bloodiest of all 5 D-Day landing beaches. But the Atlantic Wall had been breached, and the Second Front in Europe was now a reality. Captain Joe Dawson of Company G, 16th Infantry Regiment, established his command post in the village of Colville-sur-Mer. As his exhausted soldiers dug defensive positions for the night, the West Point graduate from Texas had led the first organized American unit to reach the high ground overlooking Omaha Beach, but his company had suffered 70% casualties in the process. Around him, the survivors of multiple units worked together regardless of their original assignments. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Ploger of the 5th Engineer Special Brigade worked through the night, to clear the beach obstacles and establish supply dumps for the follow-up forces. His engineers had taken enormous casualties during the initial assault, but their work was essential for expanding the beachhead. German prisoners, now numbering over 200, were pressed into service moving supplies and treating wounded soldiers under guard. Chaplain Father Joseph Bradley of the 1st Infantry Division moved among the wounded and dying, providing last rites and comfort to soldiers of all faiths. The Catholic priest from Boston had volunteered for combat duty. Despite being eligible for safer assignments, and his presence on the battlefield provided spiritual strength to men facing their darkest hours. German medics, working alongside American corpsmen, showed the universal humanity that transcends national boundaries. General Oberst Friedrich Dahlmann, commanding German 7th Army, received his first comprehensive reports about the Normandy landings during the evening hours. The magnitude of the Allied assault was becoming clear, but conflicting intelligence about additional landings at Pas-de-Calais prevented him from committing his armored reserves. To counterattack the vulnerable American beachhead, Staff Sergeant Curtis Cullen of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron made a discovery that would prove crucial in the coming weeks. While examining a destroyed German tank, he realized that steel hedgerow cutters could be welded to American Sherman tanks, enabling them to break through the Norman bocage country that lay ahead. His practical innovation would save countless lives in the battles to come. Private First Class Charles Neighbor of the 16th Infantry Regiment wrote a letter to his parents in Iowa, describing the events of June 6th in terms that capture the mixture of horror and pride felt by the surviving soldiers. His words reflected the transformation of young American civilians into hardened combat veterans through their ordeal on Omaha Beach. "We have done something that will be remembered forever, but the price was higher than anyone imagined." The German survivors, now trapped in isolated pockets or retreating inland, began to understand that their situation had become hopeless. The young Bavarian faced a choice between fighting to the death or surrender. Knowing that either decision would end his war, naval fire support continued throughout the night, as destroyer squadrons maintained their positions close to shore, ready to respond to any German counterattack. The close cooperation between Navy and Army units, forged in the crucible of combat, had proven decisive in breaking through the Atlantic Wall. Lessons learned at Omaha Beach would be applied in future amphibious operations across the Pacific and European theaters. By midnight on June 6th, the beachhead was sufficiently secure to begin landing heavy equipment and supplies for the advance inland. The first Sherman tanks to successfully negotiate the beach obstacles took up defensive positions on the high ground, their crews knowing that dawn would likely bring German counterattacks. Designed to drive the Americans back into the sea, the sacrifice of the soldiers who died on Omaha Beach had purchased a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe that would never be relinquished. Dawn on June 7, 1944, revealed the full scope of American success and sacrifice on Omaha Beach. The tide had washed away much of the blood from the sand, but the wreckage of war remained. Destroyed landing craft, abandoned equipment, and makeshift graves marked with helmets and rifles. Yet across this landscape of tragedy, fresh American forces were coming ashore to expand the hard-won beachhead. Major General Clarence Huebner, commanding the 1st Infantry Division, established his headquarters in a Norman farmhouse overlooking the beach, where so many of his soldiers had died. The career officer from Kansas understood that the success at Omaha Beach represented more than tactical victory. It marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. His division, bloodied but unbroken, prepared for the long campaign that would carry them to Berlin. Lieutenant William Williams of the 29th Infantry Division discovered a German military cemetery dating from the First World War while conducting reconnaissance inland from the beach. The irony was not lost on the young officer from Virginia that Americans were again dying on French soil to liberate Europe from German aggression. The cemetery served as a reminder that the struggle for freedom spans generations and requires constant vigilance. Private First Class Jimmy Green of Company A, 116th Infantry, found himself among a group of soldiers tasked with burying their fallen comrades in a temporary cemetery established on the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach. The 19-year-old from West Virginia had enlisted with his childhood friends, most of whom now lay still beneath white crosses. His letter home tried to explain the mixture of grief and pride that characterized the survivors' emotions. The German prisoners captured during the battle presented a cross-section of Hitler's Atlantic Wall defenders, seasoned veterans from the Eastern Front, teenage conscripts from occupied territories, and middle-aged men recalled from civilian occupations. Their testimonies revealed the psychological impact of Allied bombing. the shortage of supplies and ammunition, and the declining morale that had weakened German defensive capabilities. Brigadier General Norman Coda, promoted to lead the 29th Infantry Division after his heroic leadership on June 6, began planning the advance toward Saint-Vith and the eventual liberation of Paris. The fighting qualities displayed by American soldiers at Omaha Beach had convinced him that German resistance, while still formidable, could be overcome through determination and superior tactics. Colonel George Taylor's blunt assessment of the battle became legendary. Throughout the European theater of operations, the crowds have stopped shooting at us. On this beach, let's move inland and see what they've got waiting for us there. His matter-of-fact approach to combat leadership exemplified the pragmatic American military philosophy that would prove decisive in the remaining 11 months of war in Europe. Medical personnel from both sides worked together in aid stations established behind the beach, demonstrating that humanitarian values could survive even the most brutal combat. Dr. John Smith of the 16th Infantry Regiment's medical detachment treated German wounded alongside American casualties, upholding the medical profession's ethical standards under the most challenging circumstances. As the weeks following D-Day unfolded, the tactical lessons learned at Omaha Beach influenced American military doctrine. For amphibious operations worldwide, the coordination between naval gunfire and infantry assault, the importance of combat engineers in breaching obstacles, and the decisive role of small unit leadership became standard elements of military training programs. The American cemetery established at Colville-sur-Mer above Omaha Beach became the final resting place for 9,387 American servicemen killed during the Normandy campaign and subsequent operations in Europe. Each white marble cross represents not only individual sacrifice, but also the collective determination of a free people to resist tyranny regardless of cost. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's prayer, broadcast to the American people on the evening of June 6th, captured the significance of what had been accomplished. Almighty God, our sons, pride of our nation, this day have set upon a mighty endeavor, a struggle to preserve our republic, our religion, and our civilization. The soldiers who fought and died on Omaha Beach had indeed preserved civilization itself. The legacy of Omaha Beach extends beyond military history to embody the fundamental American principles of courage, sacrifice, and commitment to freedom that continue to inspire successive generations facing their own challenges and calling to service.